I can certainly taste that beautiful smokiness of that tandoori chicken. That chicken is marinated rather well. Baingan bharta. I think this is the sort of dish that would make for a great scoop with the rumali roti. There's also a sliver of green chili that has clambered onto this scoop. The mutton rogan josh. The mutton is so tender that I barely lifted it and the piece split into two owing to the effect of gravity. That's how tender I'm expecting this rogan josh to be. Hi folks, this is Kripalamana Gourmet on the Road and you're watching Food Lovers TV. I hope you're doing well. Even as you see me sitting on my balcony with my hat on, you're wondering where I'm off to. Well, I'm off to nowhere. It's been like this. Like the rest of the world, we too have been sitting at home for the last 5 or 6 weeks. I reminisce fondly some of the delicious meals that we've enjoyed. And today I was reminiscing a meal, a Punjabi style North Indian meal that we relished a few months ago from this neighbourhood restaurant called Treat in Indiranagar. They serve up a plethora of delicious kebabs and curries. These are mostly Delhi Punjabi style sort of preparations, and I was reminiscing those dishes rather fondly. So in this takeaway episode of Gourmet on the Road, we've ordered some Dilli style Punjabi North Indian Khana from Treat, a neighbourhood restaurant that's been in Bengaluru for over 28 years. Well, we're on the table with all our food from Treat, and I think it's time to put the hat away. I get really sentimental about the hat because when I place the hat on, I reminisce all the various eateries that we would go to filming Gourmet on the Road. Of course, it's been a very difficult year, over a year now, for us like the rest of the world. When we began Gourmet on the Road, the idea was to travel the country, the length and breadth of the country, and showcase the glorious food that exists in this wonderful land of ours. But of course, destiny had other plans. So for the last 12 months or so, we're trying to celebrate what's easily accessible, and therefore this lunch takeaway from Treat. The biggest challenge that I face when I do a takeaway shoot is removing the food from the containers and placing it on my survey. In fact, that's probably the most difficult, the most arduous task of doing a takeaway shoot. But then when you are speaking to the restaurant, talking to them about their dishes, talking to them about their current state of affairs, you just want to do all that you can to encourage them, and therefore we've ended up with these many dishes. So what do we have here? So let's begin with the appetizers. So of course you cannot do a North Indian style Dilli Punjabi sort of a meal without the kukkad, and therefore we have the tandoori kukkad or the tandoori chicken looking resplendent and red. And then we have, for the vegetarians, we have the Paneer Tikka, and this they call the Bewazni Paneer Tikka. So this I'm expecting to be a paneer that is light. Of course, the dish doesn't look as pretty as it would when it's served to you at the restaurant. By the time you remove the paneer from that carton that it came in and place it on your tray, you have displaced the aesthetics of that dish. But I'm sure taste-wise there won't be any difference as opposed to eating at Treat. And then we have a dish that I'm looking forward to savoring. This is the Galouti Kebab, and I think the Galouti Kebab is placed on these baby naans of sort. This is a lamb Galouti Kebab. There's a relish that it is served with. And bringing up another vegetarian dish, I haven't tasted this dish before. This is called the Kurkure Karela. So for those of you who don't like Karela, I'm told this is a Karela dish that will even convert a Karela hater into a Karela lover, and that's why I've ordered this. This is the Kurkure Karela with some capsicum, with some onions, etc. There's also a sauce that goes on to this Kurkure Karela. And then we have our main courses. For our main course, we have the baingan bharta. This is of course classic old school Dilli style baingan bharta, which reminds me we've done an extensive episode on Treat a few months ago when they were still in their old location. They have moved now to a new location only about 3 or 4 months ago, and of course the pandemic has hit them really hard. When I did my tasting at Treat, I tasted some of these dishes and also a whole bunch of other dishes. So if you want to know what else is there which is special on Treat's menu, do look up that episode. I'm going to place a link in the description and also somewhere here. I think on that tasting we tasted over a dozen dishes from Treat. So do look up that episode, that Gourmet on the Road episode, and Treat. And this is a dish that we haven't tasted in a while, so I'm really looking forward to savoring this Pindi Chole, especially with some of the breads. And then we haven't done the butter chicken. You will see the butter chicken in the previous Treat episode. We've done the rara chicken. So this basically is an interesting dish, which is a combination of chicken mince and chicken pieces that are tossed in some spices with some onion, etc. This is a dish that I'm looking forward to tasting. I've tasted the rada gosht, which is basically the same dish but made with mutton. And then of course, bringing up the grand finale of our Treat takeaway is this rogan josh. Rogan of course refers to all that fat, the oil that's released from the fat of the meat that floats to the surface of the dish, and therefore rogan. And some people also say this is a dish that came to Kashmir from Persia, and rog is also derived from the Persian word rouge, meaning red. And then of course the josh refers to the josh of the dish. This is a dish that's quite robust in its flavors. The meat is cooked. The meat is braised along with the fat, along with some onions, the Kashmiri red chili which adds to the color of the dish, and a few other spices, with a lot of yogurt, and that lends to the richness of the dish, that lends to the Joshila character of the dish, and therefore the name of the dish, the Rogan Josh. And we have a choice of breads. So when it comes to breads, I typically try and avoid naans when I'm doing a takeaway because the naan tends to get rubbery. So we've done simple breads, we've done a couple of rumalis, we've done some rotis, and we've done a Khmeri naan as well. In fact, the Khmeri naan is something that the restaurant recommended I should try, and I think it makes sense because of that texture of that fermented bread. I think it will serve well to scoop up, to absorb the curry in that Rogan Josh. Also, of course, when you're ordering breads, it's quite easy to just heat it up in a tawa. And as I've said on numerous takeaway shoots, when we are shooting an episode of Gourmet on the Road takeaway, it takes some time before I'm able to taste the dishes, because first we have to unpack the dishes, place it in our serveware, we have to shoot the dishes for you to savor it visually, and only then can I get to eating it. So the dishes would have cooled down a tad bit, and that is something that I'm always mindful of when I'm doing a takeaway tasting. Anyway, enough talking, let's get to the food. So let's begin with the paneer for the vegetarians. This is the Bewazni Paneer Tikka. You got the peppers, you got some tomato, some pyaz too. When you're eating some of this food, actually onions always make a good accompaniment. And I'm grateful to the restaurant for being considerate enough to send us a whole bunch of onions there. So you have some sirke pyaz, which is the onion that's marinated in some vinegar, and some pyaz with quite a bit of lemon. So when you're eating food like this, you want that pyaz to give you company. And then we will go for some of that, the Galouti Kebab. That kebab has a lovely char, and there's a bit of relish too that I will help myself to very soon. Some of that Tandoori Chicken. I'm going to go for that drumstick, a juicy piece of leg, and also perhaps a breast piece. And we're going to go for some of that Kurkure Karela. I'm quite curious to know what this dish tastes like. You know, Karela is not really something that's on top of mind, and Karela in a restaurant is not really something that you are looking forward to savoring. In fact, the thought of eating Karela in a restaurant doesn't even enter your mind. And some pudina chutney just in case. And this, I'm told, is a chutney that goes with the Karela. I think I'm going to make a beginning with that paneer. That paneer is nice and soft. I've taken the liberty to microwave this for a few seconds just so that it's a little warm to the touch at least. This is a dish that takes me right back to my tasting at Treat, because I can distinctly remember that ajwain in that Paneer Tikka. What I like is that the paneer is rather moist. Also got a bit of zeera there. It's rather moist and creamy. I think that charred bit of capsicum would also make for a lovely accompaniment to the paneer. I love the charred edge of the capsicum. And then the capsicum, the moment you bite into it, releases all its juices that complements that dairy creaminess of that paneer. You know, when it comes to vegetables, when you place them in a tandoor, with that heat, the sugars in the vegetables concentrate, and therefore the flavors that you would taste, for example in that tomato, are a lot more concentrated, are a lot more punchy. I can also taste the flavor of some mint in there. So the outside of this paneer has this charred crust, and that's really where you taste most of the marinade, led largely by the flavor of the ajwain. But then as you relish the paneer in your palate, that's when the creamy character, that soft creamy character of the paneer takes over. And if you like things a little more damdar, I think that's where this chutney comes into play. I don't mean to get regional about it, but I think when it comes to North Indian food, that's where you get the best paneer. Of course, in the South too, we make paneer and we use paneer, but I think people in the North or cooks from the North know how to make the best use of paneer, and I think it begins with procuring the right paneer too. I think the paneer that's usually used in North Indian restaurants, which is a paneer that's shipped from the North, is made with buffalo milk. And I think the fat content of the milk really helps in getting the right texture, creaminess to that paneer. I think the onion also does very well as a palate cleanser of sort to wash away the flavor of that masala with its pungent moistness before I take a look at that Kurkure Karela. When you are tasting Karela, you're expecting to find its unbridled bitterness making a direct assault on your palate. But out here, as I'm tasting the Karela, what I'm tasting is, of course, its slightly fibrous texture. There's a bit of crunch. I think most of the kurkurapan has disappeared after having made that journey from the restaurant to here and waiting whilst we shot it. But that bitterness registers itself rather faintly at the very end of that bitter gourd's journey into your mouth. And I think what makes this otherwise not so interesting vegetable interesting is that chutney. So the chutney has a sweetness and also has a certain warmth that comes from chili, and there's also a hint of sourness too. I think there's a chutney with perhaps some made with some dates, perhaps some salt, some ginger. I think it's a chutney that heroes the Karela in this dish. And if the bitterness of the Karela gets a bit too much, that's where the peppers and the onions come into play. There's also a bit of red chili spice that I can taste in that. I suspect this Karela is probably also soaked in water for some time just to remove all that kadwahat, all that bitterness, before I suspect being deep fried. So if you like Karela, probably this is certainly a dish that you can try. I can certainly taste that beautiful smokiness of that tandoori chicken. The bird is marinated well. It's nice and moist. But of course, when you order a tandoori chicken, savor it the moment it arrives at your doorstep. Because I think after a while, that tandoori chicken, or any kebab for that matter, tends to dry up a bit. And especially if you attempt to microwave it even for a few seconds or so. But on the inside, the tandoori chicken is nice and moist. You know what I like about the flavors at Treat? The flavors are rather gentle. The flavors aren't the sort where the spice, for instance, obliterates your palate. So for instance, even here at the tandoori chicken, what you're tasting, in addition to the juiciness of the bird, is that gentle warmth that comes from the Kashmiri red chili that also goes in to color the chicken. That chicken is marinated rather well, because the flavor of the marinade, be it the ginger garlic, and of course the most important ingredient when it comes to a tandoori preparation is that mustard oil, has penetrated all the way into the bird. I'm also biting into some cartilage as I'm tasting this chicken. When I'm saying that with a sense of deja vu, because that's exactly what I remember from my tasting of this tandoori chicken at the restaurant too. This is a textbook tandoori chicken with its smoky flavors, that slightly pungent hit that comes from the mustard oil and the warmth of the Kashmiri chili powder, along with some other spices that have perhaps worked their way into that marinade. What I also appreciate is that the chicken is cooked perfectly all the way in. There's not the slightest hint of pink or red to suggest that it's uncooked closer to the bone. There is that mint chutney, but to be honest, that tandoori chicken needed no other flavor. I like to savor tandoori preparations just by itself. The character of the tandoori marinade and of course the character of the protein. In this case, the chicken, and in the previous instance, that paneer. Let's move on to that galouti that's topped on this mini naan. But I'm not so interested in the naan. I'm interested more in savoring that galouti by itself. I love that deep brown char that the galouti has on the surface. That is sort of preparation that quite simply disappears into a pool of melted meaty deliciousness the moment you place it in your mouth. Of course, when it comes to a galouti kebab, galouti basically means gal jana or to dissolve, and that's the character of the galouti kebab, which is what lends its name. And that character is derived from a certain amount of fat, and traditionally they use the kidney fat that's also added to that meat mince as it's minced super fine. So when you're tasting it straight off that griddle, that's when that galouti kebab is at its supreme best. Of course, after a while, after that galouti kebab cools down, I think the fat also in that kebab tends to coagulate, and therefore the kebab isn't in its pristine texture. I can also taste some of the aromatic kevda, if I'm not mistaken, that goes into that galouti. You know, the galouti looks like a simple meat patty, but this is probably one of the most complex kebabs when you look at the number of spices that go into make what looks like a deceptively simple kebab. There are dozens of ingredients that go into the making of a galouti kebab. When the galouti kebab is cooked, they also smoke it with some charcoal and I think a bit of ghee, and that's what gives it that smoky sort of flavor. There's also some relish that this galouti kebab is served with. I don't know what this relish is about. There's a radish relish that's served with that galouti kebab, and it's spiked with some chili as well. I think there's some yogurt in that, and I think that basically helps cut some of the fat. The acidity of the yogurt and the pungency of that radish and also the spicy heat of that green chili helps cut some of the fat of this galouti kebab. The complexity that comes from the warmth of spices that hits your palate is what makes this kebab extremely interesting. And the galouti kebab, given its texture, is also the sort of kebab that lends itself to being smeared almost like a pate onto this bread. And I think that's where this piece of bread comes in handy to carry forth that galouti that is smeared onto it with all its spices and all that fat. Of course, that bread, because it's been sitting out for a while, has become a tad chewy and is taking away from the impact that the galouti would have otherwise had on your palate. Well, time now to get to the main course of our treat takeaway. I'm going to make a beginning with that baingan bharta. That baingan bharta that's moist and almost velvety with that smoked baingan and of course the savory flavors of the onions and the lush textures of the tomato. Let's go for that Pindi Chole. That chole is stained a dark brown by the amla. Get some ginger juliennes as well, some green chili perhaps, and then the rara chicken. So this is a combination of chicken pieces and chicken mince that's cooked into this thick preparation. And the last, but certainly not the least, is the rogan josh. And that rogan that's floating on top of this dish, the oil from the fat, is what lends this dish its name, the rogan josh. And of course, to go with some of that meat and that pindi chole, some pyaz, some sirka pyaz, and also some lacha pyaz. And I've helped myself to two breads. I've got a rumali roti right here and also that khameri naan. And I have microwaved this plate for about 20 seconds or so, just to heat up the flavors a tad bit. I think let's make a beginning with that baingan bharta. I love that smokiness of that baingan. So you have the baingan that is first slit, sometimes stuffed with perhaps some garlic, some chili, etc. Some people don't stuff it too. And that baingan is char roasted over an open flame. And once it softens completely, that skin is peeled away and then it's cooked. It's cooked along with some spices, the onions, and of course that tomato. There's a bit of tartness too that I'm tasting. And that tartness is from the tomato, the ripe acidity of the tomato. I think this is the sort of dish that would make for a great scoop with the rumali roti. There's also a sliver of green chili that has clambered onto this scoop. There's a bit of prickly heat from that green chili. But other than that, is that smoky flavor of that baingan with the ripe acidity of that tomato that takes over the palate. Earlier I never used to like baingan. It was not one of my favorite dishes. But growing up, I had a friend in college whose mother would make a great baingan bharta. And that's really where I developed a love for that baingan bharta. And this was a friend who hailed from the north. And when it comes to a baingan bharta, there's nothing like a baingan bharta that you get in a Punjabi home. There's also a bit of that tomato seed that you bite into every once in a while, which gives you that break in texture. So you're tasting the silky velvetiness of that mashed eggplant, and then every once in a while you have that gentle pop of that tomato seed which breaks through the textures. I think next, let's turn our attention to that Pindi Chola. I think Pindi Chola perhaps comes from the word pind. Pind, I think, refers to one's hometown or perhaps one's village. I'm not sure. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. There's a bit of khatas. That chickpea is firm yet is soft and creamy on the bite. And there's a bit of khatas that comes from the amla that this chickpea is boiled in. That amla not only gives it that slightly sour character, but also stains that chickpea a dark brown, along with of course the various spices, the roasted spices that find their way into this preparation. I think the slight sourness of this dish certainly calls for some rumali roti that it needs to be cradled in. And I think you need a little bit of the bread to tone down the slightly sour sharpness, which is also where the warmth of these ginger juliens come in. Typically one is always ordering the dal makhani. Today I thought for a change we'll do something different, and that's why I thought we'll do the Pindi Chola. It's tasty in its own right, but I think there's very little that comes close to a dal makhani that's well made. Next, let's turn our attention to that rara gosh. Basically a combination of chicken pieces and some chicken mince. There's a flavor of the garlic that you taste, a bit of the ginger. You're also tasting a slight edge of the coriander and some of that garam masala. This is a dish that's rather simple in its preparation style. In fact, one would say it's quite rustic as well. I can certainly taste a bit of the flavor of the kasuri methi that probably goes into this dish. The chicken is moist and juicy. What I also like is the texture of this mince. It's quite coarse, and because it's coarse, it manages to hold on to the flavors of that masala. Because otherwise, when it comes to chicken, there's not really too much flavor inherent in the bird itself. That bird needs plenty of help from the ginger, from the garlic, from the coriander, some green chili, and the other spices that go in to make this rara murgh or the rara chicken. I think more than the chicken piece, I'm enjoying the flavor of that chicken mince. Because that chicken mince has also trapped some of that oil that this masala has been bunawed in. And that gives it that slight fattiness, which is always essential when you're tasting meat. Palate cleansed. We're now ready to meet the big daddy on the plate, the mutton rogan josh. The mutton is so tender that I barely lifted it, and the piece split into two owing to the effect of gravity. That's how tender I'm expecting this rogan josh to be. I want to savor that meat with some of that rogan josh gravy, because as that meat cooks with the fat over a period of time, all that fat, all that flavor of the meat breaks down into that gravy. That gravy which is largely onions and plenty of Kashmiri chili to give it that color. And of course there's also a fair bit of yogurt that goes into the making of that rogan josh. You can see that the meat is rich in the fat, and that's something that you most definitely need to get a good rogan josh. You need all that fat to lend its character to that meat. And that meat is the sort that slithers off the bone. It's as soft, it's as moist, it's as tenderly cooked as that. Delicious. You know, when it comes to enjoying the rogan josh, you can enjoy the meat as is, and then also find some of those meaty notes in the flavor of that curry. And I'm looking forward to mopping those flavors up with this khameri naan. I love the texture of this bread. This bread is thick and almost acts as a sponge to soak up that gravy. And also on the bite, the texture is that of bread. So that khameri, because it's fermented, doesn't tug on your bite at all. Rather, it gives in quite easily. It's quite porous, almost like bread. And that's why I think it's a perfect accompaniment to tasting a gravy that's lush, rich and thick with the flavor of the meat and the fat, like this rogan josh. There's also a bit of the fermented afternotes that I get from the bread, which you can certainly taste more when you taste the bread by itself. But then this isn't bread that you eat by itself. This is bread that you scoop up some delicious gravy with. I love the savory notes of that onion. So that onion has been bunawed to a deep savory flavor, and that's what you're tasting in that rogan josh. Now that's the one advantage of sitting at home, right? You can be shameless, absolutely. Not that I preserve any sense of dignity when I'm eating out as well, as most of you would have seen. But when you're at home, you know, you can enjoy your khana with gay abandon. After all, ghar mein hi kha rahe ho aap. I think this North Indian Punjabi meal is getting the best Hindi out of me. That's how much its flavors have registered on my palate and on my soul. Scoop up some more of that gravy with a piece of tender meat too. As you can see, there's a bit of fat that's sheathed onto the meat. And I'm told at Treat they use the goat. That's the meat that they use to make their rogan josh. If you're a meat lover and you love your mutton, that rogan josh is certainly the dish to have. In fact, I suspect that rogan josh will get a little better with time. Perhaps this is a batch that was just made this morning. But if I were to save a piece or two for the evening and let that meat sit in all that gravy, I suspect the flavors would get a lot deeper. Well, I've enjoyed my North Indian, Dilli, Punjabi style khana from Treat. I think all the dishes that I tasted were certainly impressionable on the palate. Whether it was a Tandoori Chicken, the Galouti Kebab, that Bewazni Paneer Tikka, and not to forget that smooth and smoky bangan da bharta, and also that Kurkure Karela. If you like your Karela, certainly a dish to try. But if you're not a Karela person, perhaps you can look for something else. But I think the piece de resistance of the meal here is certainly that mutton rogan josh. Even as I savor this meal, I can't help but think of the plight of many of our neighbourhood eateries. These eateries that give us so much pleasure with the delicious work that they do. To think of the challenges that they are facing, many of them barely able to eke out a living, is rather sad. I hope you and us together can do all that we can to help these neighborhood eateries, these local eateries survive, and all that it takes is one small takeaway order at a time. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Gourmet on the Road, this takeaway episode of Gourmet on the Road. Until the next time, take care, stay safe and strong. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye and happy eating. If you'd like to support the work that we do at Food Lovers TV, Do consider joining our membership community on YouTube by hitting the join button below or on the home page. You could pledge a nominal sum and receive special privileges like behind the scenes footage, shoot updates, access to live Q&As and a lot more. You could support us on our Patreon page as well. For more info, check out the links in the description below. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, like, share and leave a comment below. Happy eating!